Hi, everybody. My name is James Boston. I'm the founder of the Association of Former British Colonies. The association is a platform which was founded in 2020 by myself. The purpose of the association is to examine the legacies of British colonisation through educational content, social dialogue, and by working to inform global and UK policy change around reparations and decolonisation. I am joined today by Dorbrene O'Marde to talk about the legacies of British colonisation in Antigua and Barbuda and to explore the case for reparations and decolonisation from the wider CARICOM perspective. Dorbrene, welcome to the platform.
James, thanks so much. Quite a pleasure being here.
Thank you. It would be great if you could introduce yourself for our audience and listeners.
Yes, I am. As mentioned, I'm Dorbrene O'Marde. I'm Antiguan born, Caribbean national. I've been quite an activist for well, I guess nearly all my adult life. I like to think of myself as coming out of that Black Power period as a student at the University of the West Indies, and continued my advocacy in well, throughout the Caribbean, in North America, University of Toronto, also in the United States at Tulane University, the Black Student Movement, the African Liberation Support Commission movements, the anti-apartheid movements, etc. Presently, I serve as the chairperson of the Antigua and Barbuda Reparations Support Commission. I'm also one of 3 vice chairs of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. My background also includes quite a lot of cultural activity as playwright, as director, as a published novelist also. And I guess as a sometime poet, not one that I think much of. So essentially, that's where.
Thank you. And you mentioned the CARICOM Reparations Commission. I think it'd be great if you told our audience what is the commission, what are the aims and objectives that they're trying to achieve.
Yes, in 2013, the heads of government of CARICOM, remember CARICOM is a regional grouping of 14 countries, 13 of them, or it could be 15, and 14 of them being independent countries. The only colony that's part of that grouping is Montserrat. And so the heads of government of these countries got together in 2013. I mean, on requests, on urging from a number of community-based organizations, NGOs, for example, got together and established the CARICOM Reparations Commission. The commission was given a mandate to make the case, to assist heads of government in making the case for reparations from European colonizers in 3 particular areas: the genocide of indigenous people, the slave trade, and slavery, chattel slavery in the region. Commission is made up of the chairpersons of all the national commissions. At the time when the CARICOM Reparations Commission was established, one of the dictates from the heads of government was that all territories, all our nations as part of CARICOM, established national reparations commissions. Some had already been in existence. In Jamaica, for example, Barbados had been doing work. Here in Antigua, we had been doing work even before that particular point in time. And so presently, the commission consists of the chairpersons of these national reparations commissions. And quite recently, the commission has admitted representatives of a number of regional non-governmental organizations. For example, the Caribbean Pan-African Network, the Rastafari, the regional Rastafari organization, the Organization of Indigenous People, the Caribbean Organization of Indigenous People, from St. Martin, from Bonaire. So these groups have been added to the commission in our attempt, to democratize the work that we're doing.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And you touched on some historical atrocities there, and I suppose that's a good segue into this opening section where we can talk about some history. So let's start at the kind of basics, particularly in terms of British colonization. So why did Britain colonize Antigua and Barbuda?
Well, let me just make one point, about the country Antigua and Barbuda. It did not become Antigua and Barbuda until independence in 1981. Prior to that, the two islands existed as sort of independent colonies of each other. Although the colonizers in Antigua, particularly the Codrington family, also was granted a lease on Barbuda, on the whole island of Barbuda. And that island did not revert to British control out of the lease until around the 1900s. But let's go back, I think, to what we're really talking about is why, let's say, Antigua was colonized in the first instance. Barbuda was colonized a little later than Antigua was. The British were already in the region. It was part of that colonial empire expansion. They were already quite close to Antigua over in St. Kitts. And it is from St. Kitts that the British movement or English movement to Antigua took place back in about 1632. That point in time, the island was not fully inhabited by the Kalinago. They used clearly the archaeology and some of the history clearly showing that they used this island as a stop-off point. I mean, in their journeys up and down the Caribbean. And so the movement of the British onto the island in 1632 did not impact fully a population here in Antigua. Of course, it set up conflicts with the Kalinago, then called the Caribs, and that they were violent people. They were protectors of their space, essentially. They were the soldiers protecting their space. Of course, they got labeled as cannibals and all sorts of other queer things. But that colonization, 1632 onwards, started with attempts to cultivate tobacco. And that didn't work too well, and so the lack of water in the country, also one of the reasons that the Kalinago had not established, major colonies or major residences here in Antigua. But it was originally tobacco, and then a shift to sugar. And we would think by about the end of the 18th century, about 70% of this island was under sugar cultivation. The island has been essentially English, except for a very brief period, 1666, 1667, when the French invaded and took control of the island. That didn't last too long, a couple of months, until the Treaty of Breda, I think, was signed between the French and the English, and then the island reverted back to English control.
Okay, thank you for that. So the next question I've got on my list is, and you kind of touched on this already, but how did British colonization impact the populations of Antigua and Barbuda?
As I was saying, there was not much of a population at that point in time. The Kalinago what the history shows is that they were moving up and down these islands from as far north as Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, right down to the mainland, Guyana, Venezuela, stopping along these islands for food, for shelter, etc. And so, yeah, we did not have that sort of resident population at that point in time.
I suppose my question was more when Antigua and Barbuda came to be populated, unfortunately, by enslaved Africans, was more kind of focusing on how were those populations impacted by the British colonial regime, if you will.
Well, the impact is the impact of slavery, isn't it? The impact of chattel slavery. A little more about that history before jumping into the impact of chattel slavery. What is clear is that the Kalinago in this region fought against the colonization from Europe. French. I mean, the French were here, Portuguese, Spanish. They were all up and down these islands. And so there were frequent raids, there were frequent Carib raids, mainly coming out of the French islands, Martinique and Guadeloupe at one point in time, a little later down from Dominica. But so Antigua was subjected to these occasional Carib raids. I mean, and these existed even during the enslavement period. So if you want to talk about that period, I would say it would have started maybe around 1656, mid-1600s, when the first African enslaved persons were brought to the island. Now, the conditions of enslavement on Antigua and Barbuda were absolutely no different than anywhere else. What we are talking about is the ownership of lives by the British enslavers. We're talking about Africans who had absolutely no rights at all, who were subject to some of the most horrific terms of existence, the beatings, the hangings, the lynchings, even as early 1736. By 1736, there was a major uprising here in Antigua, led by King Court. The rebellion essentially failed, and by the end of 1736, between October 1736 up to March 1737, 87 plus the leader, King Court, were executed. A number of others would have been deported to other islands. And so during that period, the late 1700s the late 1730s, 1736 into 1737, it was just an orgy of murder. It was hangings. It was people being broken in the wheel. It was people being tossed into fires. As I say, 88 persons would have been executed. So that was the life that folks lived under those conditions. It was sun up to sundown work in the cane fields, producing wealth for Britain.
And I want to go into a bit more detail on those conditions, particularly the way that Britain structured their colony, as it were, then. What were the kind of conditions in terms of, were the enslaved Africans completely stripped of their religious freedoms, for example, their languages? What happened to their languages, for example?
Totally stripped of personhood, I think might explain it all. Languages, and the British tricks of taking the people coming from different geographical areas on the continent and putting them together. Difficulty, therefore, for them communicating with one another because they essentially spoke different languages. But yeah, we're talking about totally stripped of culture, totally stripped of dress, of religion, stripped of dress, of religion. It was the ultimate dehumanization we're talking about. We're talking about a crime against humanity, essentially.
Yeah. And were there any elements of the African culture that was able to survive?
Well, yeah. Certain aspects of it would have survived, especially issues around things like medicinal plants, the identification of medicinal plants. Certainly, some instances around food, because later on in the slavery periods, Africans had access to small plots of land for feeding themselves, and therefore I would have reverted to foods, fruits and foods, and cooking in styles that they knew. And so, yes, certain aspects of that have survived. There are other aspects in terms of music, in terms of various rhythms, particularly drum rhythms would have survived. Dance steps would have survived, and then handed down from one generation to another generation, right into our time. A couple words from various languages would have survived also, and that are in use in present day Antiguan language, which is English, but present day we have present day usage by our population. Yeah, I think those would have been the main aspects. Some aspects of religious worship were not particularly strong here in Antigua, much stronger in some of the other islands, not particularly strong here. Those would have been the main surviving traits.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that some words may have survived from indigenous African languages. Can you give a few examples?
The word nyam, for example, we're talking about nim nyam for nyam, which is really eat, which West African. Some meals, for example, like what we call here fungi, which is the corn, the boiled corn, the meal made out of boiled corn. Other words like or phrases like "come here," meaning to come here. Those types of phrases, yeah, have survived.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's kind of fast forward a bit. So, how does that history of colonization impact the present day population of Antigua and Barbuda?
It's an interesting question. How does that history itself of colonization? I think what has lasted from it and what still runs through present day society is a sense of white supremacy, a sense of British supremacy over the lives of not only enslaved people, but continued to reign over the lives of even those of us during this in independence people. What am I talking about? Our parliamentarians still swear allegiance to the Queen, well, now to the King of England. These are people that we elect, that swear allegiance, not only to the King or the Queen, they swear allegiance to their successors also. You cannot enter the Antiguan Parliament without that swearing allegiance. The monarch exists, she's on our, well, she, on our money, on our stamps, the operation of the civil service essentially still has all the remnants of British forms within our constitution and our laws. You know, Britain still is very, very present. We still have laws on our books here in Antigua and Barbuda after independence dealing with issues like against anti-obia, which when we spoke a bit about, religious practices that would have existed. But so the laws are still, there's still laws on our books about gatherings, about the size of gatherings, watching and besetting. There's still laws on our books that will allow prison authorities to use cat o' nine tails to be whipping people. Although not practice, they still remain on our books. And I guess they can be pulled up at any particular time. Our official documents would all be shaped, as they were during the colonial period. So yes, I mean there is still ongoing impact right up to independence, Antigua, of these British states.
And what about the economy of Antigua and Barbuda? How has that been impacted by British colonization?
Well, it remained sugar based up to monocrop sugar, up to about, I would say, up to about mid 1950s, maybe a little later than that, mid 1960s, before some diversification started into tourism in the first instance. So it was a sugar-based economy. I mean, based on the sort of estate structures that had been established from the onset of colonialism. The same forms of production of sugar, production of a raw sugar that was then sent off to the United Kingdom, where it is refined and then sold back to us, very expensive, a very expensive fossil, expensive costs essentially, and that would have lasted up to, as I say, mid 60s. Diversification begins to take place into tourism, and subsequently, in the last decade or two, we're talking about some diversification into financial services, international banking services, which is where the economy is presently.
And what about the education aspect in Antigua and Barbuda? Has conducted different interviews, myself and my other colleagues at the association, with people who are talking about the educational experience of former British colonies and explaining how much of the curriculum is very much based on a British style education system. Is that also the case in Antigua and Barbuda?
Very much so. Very, very much so. The structure, we wrote British school exams. I would say up to maybe about 2 decades ago, before the Caribbean Examinations Council took over, writing school leaving exams for our Caribbean populations. But we wrote the Cambridge exams and the A levels, the Cambridge. There would have been Cambridge, I think, Cambridge School Certificate, Cambridge O levels, Cambridge A levels, higher school, I think they were called. Yeah, it was that structure. As a matter of fact, that structure extended itself also into the University of the West Indies, which again in the last 2-3 decades, etc., has been breaking away from that British pattern. But even at the university level, the University of the West Indies was established as a college of Cambridge University back in the late 1940s. Became independent as an independent University of the West Indies, maybe about a decade later. But yes, the structure, the content, essentially, we taught British history, knew very little about Caribbean history, geography, all centered, knowing up and what the hills and mountains and meadows in Europe, etc., etc. So it was not only in style and structure, it was also in content. I would say that perhaps one of the positive things that has happened in the region has been the emergence of some Caribbean style, although the content still needs to be addressed. The lack of teaching of Caribbean history, for example, in our schools has become a very, very serious point of contention for those of us, for example, in the reparations movement. And so there is still work to be done there. But yes, that British style, British content lasted up to about about 2 decades ago.
So what's the kind of overall public attitude towards British colonization now? Is the general public in Antigua and Barbuda seeing British colonization in a particular way now?
Rather benign, I think the population becomes aware of the impact and the continuing impact of British colonization when major issues are brought to the fore. For example, about 5 years ago, a major issue here in Antigua was this whole question of us joining the Caribbean Court of Justice. The Caribbean Court of Justice set up 25 years ago as an alternative to the British Privy Council, which all during colonization had remained as our apex court until the formation of the Caribbean Court of Justice. In the Antigua Constitution, and this is another way that Britain has sort of maintained sort of levels of control over many of our territories, that they built things into the Constitution, making it difficult to even change the Constitution itself. And so in some of these entrenched clauses in our Constitution, for example, that we are locked into the Privy Council. And the only way we can get away from the Privy Council, even to join our own Caribbean Court of Justice as the highest court in the land, was to have a referendum demanding which required to a 2/3 majority. Getting a 2/3 majority on any subject in these small populations that are politically divided, the two-party system, the British model, another part of that legacy, that Westminster model that still exists in our countries. Getting a 2/3 majority is virtually impossible. And so we remained locked in to the Privy Council. Now, your question was about, how does the population react? Does it have understanding about these issues? And this is what I'm saying. It's only in the battle to try and convince this population to vote for the accession to the Caribbean Court of Justice that these issues are really brought to the fore in any meaningful way. Incidentally, the referendum failed, and so we are still locked in to the Privy Council. So it's issues like this, issues in our discussions about reparations, for example, issues in our discussions about further decolonization, if we want to begin to talk about republicanism, etc. That the population perhaps becomes a little more active in discussing and analyzing, these issues that we are talking about.
And in terms of decolonization reparations, that's a kind of nice segue into the sort of final section, really, of the interview. I'm actually going to start with the kind of the curriculum in schools. Is British colonization taught in schools at all in Antigua and Barbuda?
Well, not as a direct subject, but existing, of course, in how history is taught, in how geography is taught, in how social sciences are taught. I would think in many ways in how economics are taught. Yeah, but not as a direct subject at all.
I suppose my question was more, you use the term crimes against humanity, obviously, and that's connected to the case for reparations, which we'll come to shortly. But it is British colonization taught in a way that really addresses the horrors that took place during empire.
Not in detail.
Okay.
Rather cursory. Yes, we knew that slavery, and we knew that slavery took place between this and this, and we knew that slavery ended in 1834. But in terms of the details of what that enslavement period meant, no. We have understanding, that there was a trade union movement, really an anti-colonialist trade union movement that took place in the country late 1930s that essentially led us right up to this whole question of political independence. Yeah, it starts very, very scant details, and so those of us in reparations movement are finding it necessary to be really detailing a number of these things. One of our recent discussions would have been around Sir Hilary Beckel's last publication, How Europe Underdeveloped the Caribbean. And so those conversations are becoming a little stronger, as we go along. But generally, no, not in any particular detail.
Okay, and let's get on to reparations itself. So my first question is, can you explain why? Well, it's sort of a two-part question, but can you explain why there's a need for reparations in Antigua and Barbuda? And secondly, what steps need to be taken for that to manifest?
The need for it, of course, is historical.
Yeah.
The need for it is that international law, international protocols call for repair to damage that has been done. And so we have identified in those three areas that I would have mentioned earlier, we would have identified the slave, that's how the genocide of indigenous people, the slave trade itself, and slavery as crimes against African people, and crimes that their descendants are calling on those who committed crimes for an apology and for repair. Well, even before we reach to repair, for that promise that those crimes will not take place again. And thirdly, we are calling for repair to the damage that has been done to our population, to our peoples, to our countries, that you repair it as best as you can at this point in time. I certainly need to fill that in a bit. So what we are talking about identifying the crime that has been committed, which we have just done, and we need to be able to identify within the societies the particular hurts that we can identify that are totally committed to the crime in the first instance, so that it's not arbitrary. The claim for reparations is based on us being able to connect the crime, the crimes with what we are seeing as the manifestations of that crime. And so the Caribbean Reparations Commission has really issued what is referred to as our 10-point plan for reparatory justice. And what the 10-point plan does is that it identifies those areas in our society where we can identify hurt from. And so we're talking about issues in health, issues in education, issues in that intergenerational transmission of trauma. We are talking about cultural, a whole bunch of cultural and heritage issues. Critically, also, we're talking about debt forgiveness on the basis that a large portion of Caribbean debt is monies borrowed to address issues related to areas like education and healthcare. I mean, that as the chairman Sally Beckles always says, part of the mess left in this region after the British left. And so when we're talking reparations, he always puts it this way. He's calling the British to come back into this space to help to clear the mess that they left. And that mess, of course, includes issues that some that I mentioned, health and education in particular. We're also talking about a specific program for indigenous people. We would have estimated that the indigenous population would have been reduced from about 3 million when Columbus landed down to about 30,000 when we did last census, maybe in about 2000. The majority in Ghana, Suriname, Trinidad, Dominica, some in St. Vincent, not too many in the northern end of the Caribbean chain. So that is what the reparations claim is, that we have identified a crime against humanity that has been committed against African people, African and indigenous people. And we are calling on Europe and we're calling to those colonizers essentially to repair the damage that they did.
That makes sense. And I think what I'll do is I'll put a link in the description of this interview to the CARICOM 10-point plan so that everybody can see. I think it's really important to kind of emphasize that reparations isn't just a payoff, for example, which sometimes I've noticed critics of the reparations movement will often try and reduce this just down to, well, you're just asking for a payoff for slavery, for example. But actually, it's much more comprehensive than that in terms of the CARICOM reparations mandate.
That's right. We also call for assistance for resettlement of Africans who wish to go back to the continent. It's not a question of asking anyone to pay passages, for people to go back. It's a question of ensuring that social, legal possibilities for resettlement exist back on the continent. We have had, I think a last count, maybe between 15 and 20,000 Caribbean folks who have gone back to the continent. But it's all in many instances not very secure in terms of education, in terms of citizenship, in terms of land ownership, in terms of education for children, in terms of accessing health care, issues of visas, issues of work permits still exist. And so when we are talking resettlement, as you quite rightly pointed out, we're really not in this particular instance talking about money. We are talking about making those arrangements possible for those who want to go back. And so we're really talking about diplomatic, political, diplomatic, legal, being put in place to enable that resettlement. That's essentially one part of the 10-point plan also.
So what has been Britain's response to CARICOM's calls for reparations? I've seen recently that there have been calls for reparations from the royal family, obviously the British government themselves. What have been the kind of responses?
The response has been fairly steady. Why are you wanting to bother about this? This thing happened a long time ago. Let's not go back in history. Let's look forward. Yes, it was a horrible period. It was, but none of us alive today were involved in it. Will you please move forward? All those arguments have been debunked. And we continue working at debunking them. They keep coming at us. Slavery took place a long time ago. It was legal at the time. It was Africans who sold Africans. That has been the sort of content of the response. Until quite recently, we are hearing a little different narrative coming, for example, from King Charles III. King Charles III would have come to this region when Barbados achieved its republicanism, its republic status. And in his address there, he made mention of how horrible this whole thing was, and it really shouldn't have happened. But, we are glad that we have remained friends, etc., etc. He went on to the heads of government in Rwanda, heads of Commonwealth governments that took place in Rwanda. And he then made a different statement. The statement coming from him was that the discussion about slavery, it's a discussion whose time has come. And in that way, we felt a sort of slight opening into at least the royal family's discussion. And he has made 2 or 3 similar statements since that period. We are seeing some movement within the British Parliament, especially the Caribbean descent, the parliamentarians of Caribbean descent, black parliamentarians that are prepared to begin to push these issues in the British Parliament. Prime Minister Sunak, has recently just dismissed the idea of reparations. It's about 2 or 3 months ago. But we don't expect he will be in power too long. That's a bit jump in the future a bit. But we think it's changing. When the Kingdom of the Netherlands issues apologies, full apologies from the Prime Minister, followed by a full apology from the King of the Netherlands, the implications are clear that those apologies, although coming from the Kingdom of the Netherlands, in many ways serve as apologies from a lot of Europe, as the Dutch themselves were central to European slavery in this region, in finance, in technology, in the provision of enslaved people, because what the Dutch would have set up, nearly like a wholesale slavery on Curacao or Aruba it was, where they would have captured ships and transferred enslaved people to that particular country for further sale back to other European countries. So that the Dutch were very, very central, and that apology from the Dutch, and this is where our work is presently, to pursue these issues, to follow all the various trains of thought that come off of those sorts of discussions. And we have had major now apologies from families.
Yeah.
So that we've had the Trevelyan family apologizing. Only 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Gladstone family came to Guyana and issued an apology to the Guyanese people, the Guyanese government, where they had owned up to, I think, 2,500 enslaved people owned. I said, where they had 2,500, about 2,500 African people, and another 800 in Jamaica under their control. We are now hearing apologies out of universities, Jesus College, for example, out of business, the alcohol, Green King pub people, the Bank of England, and critically, a few weeks ago, we've had apologies from the Church of England,
Yeah.
which for the third time is apologizing, but this time has essentially been setting aside monies for repair. We also have operating now in the United Kingdom a repair campaign, which is the campaign being financed by Dennis O'Brien, owner of the Digicel Corporation, and that repair campaign is essentially, I think, one of its aims is to employ a number of public relations companies to help to spread the word in the British public about the whole reparations claim, about the CARICOM 10-point plan. And so, we feel quite good at this moment from the CARICOM Reparations Commission point of view that the claim has now moved beyond a Caribbean claim. And now we're really talking about a global struggle for reparations. We've had the number of African countries that have come on board, and the African Union has now expressed its support for the Caribbean call for reparations. Wonderful support coming across South America. Key support has always been present from Cuba, and a number of regional and international organizations, UN organizations, etc. Very, very close links between the CARICOM Reparations Commission and NAC, which is the North American African Reparations Commission, active within the United States. And so this whole struggle is being globalized. And we see where the work needs to be done, and we will continue along these lines.
That sounds really promising, and like a lot of progress is being made. Just to close the interview, how can people support the CARICOM Reparations Commission and their work?
It's about spreading knowledge. It really is about spreading knowledge. It's really about also challenging political leadership where the decisions are going to be made. Yes, we are we are very happy about what is happening in civil society. But we rarely see the main reparations taking place under sovereign to sovereign negotiations. It's CARICOM governments to the government of the United Kingdom. And so in many ways, there are diplomatic and political battles that need to be won to force these discussions, to force the possibility of sovereign to sovereign negotiations about reparations. And so I think, the influence or the abilities that citizens would have is actually influencing the political making decisions.
That makes sense. Thank you very much for your time today, Dorbrene. It's been a really insightful and I think useful interview. And hopefully you talk about sharing knowledge. Hopefully this interview serves to share some knowledge and really kind of emphasize the importance of CARICOM's reparations mandate as well.
Thanks so much, James. And wishing your organization, I think, much more success. Thanks for reaching out. We certainly appreciate the ability, to share our thoughts through your platform.
Thank you. This interview will be uploaded onto YouTube, also onto our social media channels. Look out for some of the micro clips created from this interview as well. But once again, thank you for listening. And Dorbrene, thank you once again for taking the time out for this interview. Thank you.
Wonderful.